Hello, and welcome to tonight's public lecture entitled Craft and Creed. At Ambrose, we are committed to conversations about the Christian faith and academics, whether in science, the social sciences, the humanities, or as tonight, in the arts. I am pleased to introduce our guides for tonight's conversation about Christianity, the Church, and the arts. They are Barrett Heilman, Chair of Ambrose Arts and Associate Professor of Theater, Val Liskey, Associate Director of Theater, and Dr. Colin Toffelmeyer, Chair of the School of Ministry and Associate Professor of Old Testament. All three are deeply invested in exploring the relationship between Christianity and the arts. So once again, welcome to tonight's public lecture, Craft and Creed.
Craft and creed, it's what we need to be whole, to feed our soul. When we try to separate God from art, I think we break his heart just a little. When we try to separate art from God, he thinks it's odd because he's a creator, a translator between the tangible and the divine, between the brilliant and the fine, between the water and the wine. In the beginning, God created. He traded staying in heaven for coming to earth and giving birth to us, the ultimate creation. Little artists made in his image, made to make, made to take inspiration from him. He molded the hills and painted the skies. He danced the fields and sang the sunrise. He did not give a lecture, but told us a story that reminded us of his glory. And he said, "Be like me, and we'll agree to create together. Make something from nothing, make beauty from pain. And if you let me, I'll do this again and again, taking the broken and making it strong, inviting the outcast to where they belong. My art is in everything, from a seashell to a tree. But if you're looking for the holy, you'll find it in humanity, the sanctity of life, in the scars that will not heal, in the pain you try to conceal, in the emotions you don't want to feel. I am there. That is my heart. That is my art that I am most proud of. My crowd of witnesses to witness this, the greatest story told that never gets old. A God who creates and mandates us to do the same as the best way to proclaim him. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight as we have a conversation around craft and creed, two of my favorite things to talk about, with a theologian and an artist. I'm so pleased to be joined by Barrett and Colin. Hopefully you guys have figured out which is which, who's the theologian and who's the artist. But before we get started tonight, I'm going to ask you to respond to a quote that I have. Garrison Keillor said, "If you can't go to church and for just a moment be given transcendence, then I can't see why anyone should go. Just a brief moment of transcendence causes you to come out of church a changed person." Talk to me about that quote, and if you have experienced transcendence in church, and what that looked like.
Transcendence is a complicated idea. I think that Keillor is on something important and probably profound. I think that worship is probably, maybe I would say it's maybe hopefully more than that, but probably not less than that, right? That it should engage one in even just a moment of transcendence is quite something, actually.
Yeah. As someone who worked at a very large church and also runs a theater company, transcendence is important to me. And maybe sadly, I feel like I have experienced it more in the theater than I have at church. But for some reason, maybe it's the authenticity part. I'm not exactly sure, but I certainly I've experienced it in both places for sure. But yeah.
There's a kind of interesting irony there because church is the place that's trying to do transcendence on purpose, I think. And in the theater, I certainly think that, not just the theater, certainly the theater or in movies or in art or whatever form of art we're talking about, I do think that artists are shooting for profound experiences, but I'm not sure they're all shooting for transcendence. Like when we say the word transcendent, we mean something that is beyond
Right.
our sort of material plane or our existence or who we are as simple humans, or however you want to express that.
Right.
I mean, I've had moments that I consider to be transcendent watching films that I know for a fact are made by atheists,
Right.
or by you know, agnostics who are uninterested in the question at hand, or however you want to express it. Right.
Right.
It's a hard question to kind of peel apart because
Right.
of that.
Right. Let's talk for a minute about what the historical relationship of the arts to the church is.
I could give you like a little overview of that, and you could, starting it with Greek history, arts was connected to religious festivals right away. They were pagan, they weren't Christian, but that was sort of the birth of particularly theater. But other arts were definitely involved in that. You know, then we have kind of the Dark Ages, and we don't really know, but moving out of the Dark Ages into the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, the arts were kind of reborn in the church. People in the Middle Ages would not think of artists as artists in the way that we talk about it now. They would call them craftsmen. They did crafts, and art was a tool for worship and a tool for an expression of the gospel. And yeah, we sort of think of craftsmen maybe as hobbyists, but they took it pretty seriously. They were building like the craft of building worship spaces. You know, they take 150 years to build a cathedral or whatever. So they were looking at excellence in craft because it was serious business, the gospel, and sharing it through art. So, but that's how artists were viewed then. They were craftsmen. They did that. When we move sort of out of the Renaissance into Romanticism, we change the view of an artist. This is when artists started to be looked at as artists with a capital A, artists, artists as celebrity, artists as kind of like a shaman or a guru, some sort of leader into unknown experience, maybe into transcendence, but. Yeah, and perhaps the problem with that is that all artists weren't necessarily up to that, and so then they'd have to help themselves along by through travel or other kinds of experience, drugs, hallucination, other things like that, and that perception of the artist as sort of a mysterious creature who's channeling something that can give way. We still have a bit of that in our culture today, and I think that had a influence on the church too, because then those artists were a little bit not controlled, a little bit scary, very emotional. It had to do a little with technology too, because now a camera could capture reality, and so arts weren't just reflecting the material world; they were reflecting emotion and abstraction, and that kind of continued on into the 20th century. Where there was both the search for purity in art. So this is where you get like visual art with you get visual art with like Piet Mondrian or Rothko or somebody like that, where it's just like, oh, here's a big blue square. It's like pure color. Art doesn't have to be representational anymore, and it also led to a lot of cynicism. I think that art can't necessarily answer the big questions anymore, but it can ask them. So these worldviews have shaped the contemporary church and its relationship with art. Sometimes I think we get the worst of all worlds. We get the craftsmen of the Middle Ages and say, well, it's just a technical thing. It's not a performance. We don't want to put too much into it, but we don't take it quite as seriously as they took their craft. We get this sort of fear of the artist as an eccentric or a shaman or a guru or something that's a little mystical, and we push away from that. And then we get into sort of the postmodern idea of art as choice, and it's like my truth or your truth or anybody's truth. Well, the church is in the business of sort of defining what truth is, and so they're a little bit scared of that. And so I think artists coming into contemporary worship and contemporary art in the church, I'm not sure they know exactly where to land.
Yeah.
And that may be one of the problems with figuring out worship art and the church today.
Yeah, I think, again, as someone who worked at the church for many years, one of the things that I bumped up against was the leadership, the pastors struggling with, well, your art just asked a bunch of questions, and they're in the business of answers, in the same way as there's a bit in the business of truth, capital T, right? And so they were a little well, what do we do with that little skit you just did that left us all hanging? And I'm very used to trusting my audience enough to figure it out or have a conversation or buy a book, or that this is just the beginning. And often in the church, it's like, oh, whoa, we get paid the big dollars to actually answer those questions. And so, yeah, I think, where do you think it went? I would say more modern day, but where do you think it went so wrong in this disconnect? That even today, I feel that there is a skepticism, there is a fear. Again, I would say musicians are in a different category. Music has tended to be able to retain its status in the church and not be so suspect. But as far as visual or storytelling or dance, is still sort of dangerous or risky. Why? What do you think the church is pushing back against in that?
I mean, it probably depends on what church we're thinking about is part of the conversation here. Because we teach in a Protestant evangelical context, we tend to think of Protestant evangelicalism as sort of our default horizon of imagination. I mean, but if you go and hang out in, say, an Orthodox church today, you're going to find the experience to be sort of profoundly artistic and aesthetic, and framed by aesthetic ritual in certain ways. And I know that there's at least a couple of historians on the call, so it makes me a little bit nervous as real historians listening. But if we can play a little fast and loose, I would say that some of what's going on harkens all the way back to the Reformation. So we think about the Reformation, some of the things that the reformers are confronting and trying to challenge are related to some of the sort of artistic craftsmanship that Barrett was talking about, and the way that it's being used and appropriated in churches. So if we think about the use of visual aids to direct worship, whether that's stained glass windows or it's icons or statues or whatever visual aids in sanctuaries, they're built by artisans. They're beautiful pieces of art that are part of the sanctuary. But the reformers, at least some of the reformers, and it's certainly more extreme versions of the Reformation, feel some anxiety about that. They feel some anxiety about what they think of as a form of potential idolatry, right? What if we're worshiping the beauty of the statue and we're not worshiping God and God's self? So there's some anxiety wrapped up with that. And there, again, some of the reformers are less anxious about this. Some ends of the pool in the Reformation are very, very, very anxious about this. So much so that they will sort of strip churches completely bare. So there's nothing, right? There's nothing at all. There's pews. There's a wooden altar or pulpit for the sermon, because what they want, and you can understand the impulse, what they're looking for in those extreme cases is they want to hear from God. And they believe that the way that we hear from God is by means of the scriptures, and the scriptures exposited or preached. And so the only art that we really then develop at that point is spoken art. And this also goes to your comment about music, Val. The other thing that tends to get held onto is music. And so if we think about Calvin, so Calvin's not extreme in this conversation. He's not as extreme as some of the strong reformers or the Anabaptists. But when Calvin thinks about the use of music in worship, which is an art form, he's interested in its formational capacity. How can the congregation learn? How can they be formed into the nature of Christ? And even for him, it's very closely related to how can they learn scripture. And so one of the things that you'll find in Calvinist churches, especially like as we go sort of down the road from Calvin himself, is you're going to find what we call metrical psalters, or you're going to find basically hymn books that are built out of the book of Psalms. So this is the Bible, but then put into like a singable format of some kind. And there's a bunch of different versions of this. But a lot of this comes out of that Reformation tradition of we recognize that singing can be formative and powerful. People can hum these tunes while they're like hanging out the washing or cooking supper or plowing the field or whatever. So it's for regular people who are maybe not literate. But we kind of want them to sing, something theologically accurate. And so for some, that's scripture and scripture alone. For others, like maybe Luther, he's happy with an adaptation thereof. And so if you think of a hymn like Mighty Fortress is Our God, it's an adaptation of a psalm, but it's not a psalm as such. So yeah, I mean, like that's, I think where some of this gets started. But then, how Protestantism goes in many, many different directions over the course of centuries, and ends up in lots of different places. But another piece that we might add to this puzzle is that North American Christianity, and it's worth noting that in this conversation, we're really talking about sort of European and Northern global versions of Christianity and the arts. And this conversation would be different, for example, if we had somebody from the global South speaking into this conversation. But if we're talking about North America, North American Christianity has been mostly dominated by evangelical Protestantism that has some of these like iconoclastic impulses, has some of these impulses to do with art or to be anxious about art, or like Barrett said, to have sort of like a complicated relationship with people who want to ask hard questions, right? Like, we don't know if we really want to do that in the church or not. And so maybe some hesitancy on that regard. And that also maybe leads to what we might describe as some, if we're going to use a fancy word, be like an instrumentalism. And this is again sort of related to what Calvin was trying to do, that the music is for something. So if you can tell me what it's for, maybe we can do it. But visual art in the church, well, tell me what it's for, Val. If I don't know what it's for, you know what I mean?
Cross.
Yeah, if it's not a cross at the front of the church.
Or picture of baby Jesus.
Then what's it there for? Yeah.
Right.
Well, what is it doing to people?
Right.
Which is an interesting question to ask. But I think that's where some of that impulse comes from, at least.
Right.
I don't know if Barrett has things he wants to push back or add to that, but.
No. Other than I don't necessarily think that the caution is always wrong either, right? There's probably good reasons to be suspicious of capital A artists and whatever sort of, because egos are involved and things like that. So I think it's healthy to ask questions about what should be in church and what shouldn't be, and where different kinds of art forms belong and what they can and can't do and all of those things. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that this is a conversation that we're interested in having at Ambrose kind of on a regular basis is to think then about, so if we think about a worship service, we're having like a theological conversation. Like what is worship? That's a theological question.
Right.
Now, of course, if art is going to be incorporated into worship, now we want to also have an artistic question. Those aren't the same field of study. They aren't the same method of exploration of truth or reality.
Right.
And I need somebody like Barrett to help me out with parts of that question. Right? There are parts of that question.
Right.
I can talk about what I think worship is, theologically speaking. And I can talk about what I think from a theological perspective the church is. I can speak about ecclesiology. And if I say I think art should be a part of this, maybe one of the things I should be doing now is saying, hey, are there any artists in the room or anybody who specializes in the nature of art, who philosophizes about art? Would you like to be part of that conversation and talk to us about what you think art is and talk to us about why we think these boundaries are complicated?
So I love that the very first way that God introduces himself to humanity is as an artist. Mm-hmm. In the beginning, God created. First 5 words, it's the way, he doesn't open the door and say, hey, hi, nice to meet you. I'm your savior. I'm your Lord. I am the King of Kings. He says, hi, nice to meet you. I'm a creator. Oh, and just so you know, you're created in my image. I love that. So let's talk a little bit about what the Bible says about art and worship. It starts Genesis 1. Certainly there's lots more into Exodus. But let's unpack a little bit of that. Where does art and artistry and craftsmanship show up in the Bible?
I mean, I'm the Bible guy, but I'm interested in Barrett's answer first.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you started in Genesis, because I actually think, in terms of that sort of being created as creators, or being created in the, a lot of artists talk about that, and it sort of, helps sort of prop us up or give us legitimacy or whatever, like, oh yeah, we're creators just like God. But I actually think it goes farther than that in this idea of stewarding creation. We're supposed to fill and subdue it, and if you take that idea of fill and cultivating it, well, what do we fill it with? Are we improving on creation somehow? I feel like God has gifted us the earth to fill and to somehow improve upon, or to work with our hands, work with our minds, and create. So that's maybe a theological take, but I think that is part of it. In terms of examples in the Bible, there's lots, and some of them are crazier than anything you would see in church or in other kinds of artistic contexts today. It's way out there. It's way like the.
It's not safe and fun for the whole family.
No, the prophets and things. Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that the first person that's mentioned as being filled with the Holy Spirit in the Bible is an artist. That's significant to me, and interesting that sort of filled with the divine Spirit is what it says in Exodus, and it's Bezalel who was instructed to make the tabernacle, and yeah, there's artist rendering of that too. He's Bezalel, but he was a wood craftsman, a metal worker. He was making the Ark of the Covenant. All of those are important tasks. Somebody had to do it, and God wanted somebody who was good at their job. So that's interesting. We have examples of God having specific instructions about what the priests wore, the priestly vestments. So you've kind of got God as costume designer there, and I don't say that in a trite way. I mean, it's just that God was taking seriously what are people wearing in these kinds of circumstances. Obviously, we have the Psalms, so we know songwriting is a thing, but not just the Psalms. We've got the Song of Moses, who was giving that to the entire Israelite nation. One translation called it "no trifling matter." I love that. Like this, we're taking this work seriously as a songwriter. And then you get into some of the stuff with the prophets. Jeremiah, he had a hard job as a prophet. Some of the stuff that God asked him to do, there's an example in Ezekiel where he's instructed to portray the siege of Jerusalem by carving it into brick, but then putting up iron against it, which I think is reflective. And then he was to lay down against that, and he was to stay there for a long time, and he could only cook his food over fire that was fueled by human dung, and then he had to shave his head with the sword, and then take the hair and sew it into his garments. I mean, this is high drama. This is performance art. This is theater.
You could, yeah. Actually, you'd have a better chance of grant money than doing just a painting.
100%.
Yeah.
So we have lots of examples of not just artists in the Bible, but God commanding that. Of course, we know Jesus is a great storyteller, and I mean, God, people talk about method acting, but God became human. We talk about people becoming their character. God really did that. So there's lots of things you could point to biblically in terms of examples.
Right.
Yeah, and I agree with all that, everything that Barrett said. There are a number of things that I think are interesting to pick up. To go back to your initial example, Val, when you talk about God is creative initially, and then human beings are creative because we're created in the image of God. We are procreative. Now, we usually use the term procreation to talk about having children, but procreation is the like the way we instantiate or the way we articulate or live out our creative nature. Our creative nature is always an expression of the image of God within us. Like nobody is a greater creator than the creator. The creator, every time we create anything, we're creating an approximation of something that God actually created, right? Even the most abstract painting, right? Even an instance of whatever, abstract expressionism or pointillism or whatever strange postmodern art we get into, or like atonal symphonies, or all of these peculiar things, they're all manipulations of reality, a reality that was created by a God who is intrinsically creative. So we're always articulating our, we're bearing the image of God in those moments, is one of the things I would say. I think Bezalel, again, is an interesting example. Receiving the Holy Spirit. One of the things I've heard any number of artists talk about, including artists that have no particular sort of religious background. There's a novelist named Terry Pratchett. He's a famous British novelist who wrote all sorts of peculiar fantasy, science fiction, all sorts of wild stuff. He's a very fun artist. Would talk about artists like being hit by flying creativity through the ether.
Muse.
Yeah, they're just like bam, they just gets right. Or like the muse is like another way of like but all of that is a way of trying to articulate the fact that in some sense when you're doing artistic work, it feels sometimes like
It's outside of you.
it's outside of you. Somebody's doing it to you, through you, for you.
Right.
And so when we talk about the Spirit working through the artists building the tabernacle, I mean, I think it's an attempt to articulate what we're talking about, to say that it isn't just, they're not just making it up from within, it's a relational experience where they are encountering the divine and then articulating that encounter.
Right.
Barrett mentioned a whole bunch of places in the Bible where the Bible has art in it. The Bible is art.
Well, yeah,
I would
we could
say.
talk about that too.
I mean, yeah, the Bible is literary art. The Psalms are poems.
Right.
I'm in my Hebrew class right now. I've got my Hebrew students translating the Song of Songs, which is some of the most extraordinary poetry in humanity's history, I would say. And one of the funnest things about that class is because we're doing it in Hebrew, you can see the artistic structure much more clearly. And so one of the really fun things we do in that class is I'm like, so here's the grammar and the syntax. We talk about the technical stuff. I'm like, okay, talk to me about the poetry. And then we break apart the parallelism, we break apart the inverted parallelism, we break apart the macro structure where, oh wait, this verse is using the same word that you used 7 verses ago, but then inverting the meaning of it in this case, like all these wild things that these authors are doing. There's art in the midst of it. Even the act of prophecy, like Barrett said, is performative. It's performative when like Ezekiel lies on his side or Isaiah walks around naked, but it's also performative when they speak. They speak in poetic language. They speak in metaphor, right? They speak in these sometimes difficult to understand, but creative and affecting ways.
They're using rhetorical devices,
And they do that, and you could say they're doing it because they're trying to have impact or something like that. Sure, but also it's beautiful, and I think that they're doing it because it's beautiful frequently, is what's going on there. So I think that Scripture from beginning to end is filled with stories about art and instances of people doing artistic things, but I think it is itself artistic.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah, because there's poetry, there's songs, there's
narrative.
Yeah, narrative,
everything.
story.
Metaphor,
Yeah.
Even Paul's letters are rhetorically crafted with great care. Right? They're like, it's just a letter. I'm like, no, it's not just a letter. He puts an awful lot of care into it.
Yeah.
I think about the King James Bible. I think they were actually attentive to the fact that it was art, right? There's like a group of 50 people that put that together. Yeah. And when they were getting approval for the final translation, they read it. They didn't, or they spoke it out loud.
Yeah.
That's how they got approved, right? So there's some fascinating thing, and that's why we remember the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. It's in iambic pentameter. It's in a form that that is artistic even in and of itself. And so it's interesting that the Bible itself is its own work of art.
Yeah.
I know we're doing questions at the end, but there's an interesting question that's just come through that is sort of perfect at this moment. Terry says, I was surprised to read A.W. Tozer's God Speaks in which he argues against drama and movie. He asserts that God speaks, and therefore pretending to be someone else, like acting, has no place in the church or even a Christian's life. He seems to fail to see any value in these varieties of storytelling. And he comments on his place or role or influence in this conversation in such recent history.
Yeah, I didn't know that Tozer said that, but I'm not that surprised that Tozer said that. The first thing I'll say is, the first thing I'm going to say about Tozer is that's more of a Platonic position than it is a Christian one, in my opinion, right? Like this is, I mean, one of the things that Plato grumps about is the poets and the artists making believe. Yeah. And tricking us consequently. Augustine is a little grumpy about this in the Confessions as well.
Yeah.
So I'm not. That is. It does make its way certainly into Christian tradition by means of Platonism and Neoplatonism, which is a big part of the early philosophy that Christianity is married to, and that's fine. I am to a degree comfortable with that. But also, Tozer also is living at a time when fundamentalist Christianity is sort of like the keystone version of Christianity for a certain wing of the church, and he is. I mean, he's a very sort of enlightened version of that conversation, but he sort of is in that end of the pool, I think. And there's a lot of suspicion, right, from that camp towards, particularly I think towards film, which is not new, but it's newish, even in Tozer's life, and certainly its popularization is newish. And there's anxiety about it having a corrupting influence, right? If we watch people doing these things, it's going to be corruptive, or if people are pretending to be something they're not, it's going to be corruptive. The pretending thing, I actually don't think carries really any water. We've just mentioned any number of places in Scripture where people perform on their own. Yeah, they're performative and pretending sort of in their own way, which I think is true.
For me, I'd agree. That's not a new, like what Tozer's saying comes all the way back from Plato, which is just, if you're imitating something, it's not the real thing. We should just be focusing on the real thing. I would go to Aristotle, who was kind of Plato's student, whose response was, we learn by imitation. Think about how babies learn language. Think about how we learn. And that imitation is pleasurable because it's of value. We imitate something to figure it out for ourselves. I think there's a response to Tozer. But his argument isn't a new one. It's comes from way back.
I think Madeleine L'Engle was sort of my first entry into, does something have to be real to be true? Can a story have truth? There's a story of this man who had two sons, and one. So did that
happen?
Did that happen? Was there really a man who had two sons and one? Does it matter? Does it make the truth of that story any more pertinent or powerful or relevant? Jesus talked almost exclusively in parable, Matthew says. What's a parable? A story. It doesn't say Jesus spoke exclusively in a sermon outline with 5 PowerPoint slides that had alliteration. He's like, no, he got up and told stories. Does it matter that there was a man, a good Samaritan, and that means nothing to me. The truth of the story is what matters. So it's interesting when today to say, oh, well, you're just telling a story. That's exactly what Jesus would have done. He would have done, short films and
pretty good ones, I think.
Right.
I tend to. I mean, another thing that I would add to this is there's any number of kind of philosophical presuppositions that go into, like Tozer's statement, which is really Plato. There's any number of philosophical presuppositions that go into that conversation that I'm not sure are true. Like I don't think, for example, that figurative language is less accurate or helpful than literal language. In fact, most linguists today would say that there is no literal language, that all language is in some sense metaphorical, or all language is an attempt to represent reality. In some sense, there's a great French philosopher named Paul Ricoeur, who I'm quite a fan of. And Ricoeur, when he's talking about philosophy, not theology, though he's into some kinds of theology. But when he talks about doing philosophy, one of the things he says is that
that you sort of eventually get to the edge of what you can do, literally. But that doesn't mean you want to stop. That you want to say things that are about things that are beyond your capacity to say. You want to speak beyond yourself. And the only way to do that is to speak figuratively. And I would say the same is true of expressions of art. If I want to try to say something profound about reality, sometimes storytelling is the way. And sometimes I want to express that story in a visual medium, not a written medium. And if I'm going to do that, I gotta have to have some actors who are going to embody. But one of the things is, I don't think an actor embodying a character is lying.
Right.
In fact, I think well, we have a word for that. It's called bad acting, right? If somebody,
schmacting.
Yeah, schmacting. If somebody is lying, you can tell they're lying,
Yeah.
and that's one of the reasons you can tell it's a bad movie when
You
I'm
should
watching.
teach acting class.
I know.
Right? You look
Right?
somebody up
I'm
on the
inviting
stage
them
and they're like, you are lying to me. You don't believe anything that
You
you're
don't
saying.
even believe what you're saying.
Yeah, and great actors. One of the things that sets a great actor apart is that they are not pretending to be something. They're embodying a perspective and then articulating it. And I think that's actually a profoundly Christian action. An analogy for that would be like if Barrett and I are having an argument. One of the ways I can engage in that argument Christianly is to try to be, I always hammer my students about being charitable in an argument. And one of the things you have to be able to do to be charitable is you have to be able to enter into and embody the other person's position. To step out of yourself, walk into that person's shoes and say, not what do I think Barrett thinks, but what does Barrett think about this? What does Barrett feel about this? I think that's a Christian thing to be able to do, to step into somebody's place and truly imagine. But of course, I also think imagination is a Christian
thing.
I think it's a
Yes.
Christian act. I think it's an act of procreation, right?
What is faith? Believing in something we cannot see.
Yeah,
That's
which is an act of the imagination.
It's imagination.
Yeah, it's not pretend.
Right.
It's imagination isn't pretend in the same
Exactly.
way. Yeah, it's not
Exactly.
fake, at least in my mind.
Right. The term worship arts, I feel like that's a very modern term. Where do you think that came from?
I don't know. We were talking about this ourselves, and I'm not sure. I couldn't land on a time, but I don't feel like it was very long ago.
I don't either.
Like 10, 15, I don't think 15, 20 years.
It was in our lifetime.
Yeah, I feel it's like the day before yesterday or something like that, historically
It was
speaking.
last Tuesday. Someone
Yeah.
posted it on Instagram, and we.
I think that this is a part of an attempt in North American Christianity to reckon with the fact that we maybe gave up important things in some of our departure from art and our sort of pathological pragmatism in our theology, and to say, well, wait a second, maybe we actually do care about artistic expression in some sense. But that kind of gets married, I wonder, I might be being a little bit too hard on my own people here, but evangelicals have a habit of being practically and functionally minded if it doesn't have like a purpose. And if the purpose doesn't particularly serve, say, evangelism, then we're not really okay with it. And so I wonder if that's maybe why, like, okay, we were okay with art as long as it's worship oriented or something like that. This is just like a working theory for me at the moment. I'm noodling about this myself right now since we started talking about it. I don't know what Barrett thinks about that.
Yeah, I mean, there is a functional nature. Like, you talk about theater arts or musical arts or visual arts. Those are kind of descriptors of a form or of a medium. And worship arts feels more like it's a functional term or a pragmatic term, as Colin was saying. So I do wonder about that. Although, but I mean, we need language. We need to be able to talk. We need containers to talk about what we're talking about. So I get that, but I do think there are some maybe problems of reducing art to a function.
Like if you made me in charge of everything, which nobody wants, don't do that. That's a terrible idea. It's a terrible idea. But if I was the boss of things, I would probably not use that phrasing, worship arts. I would want to talk about liturgy.
Right.
Because to go back to what we've been saying, I think all of the things that we do in, say, a worship service are driven or can be driven in some sense by a an attention towards beauty and truth, which is like an attention towards aesthetics, which is an attention toward art, the art of doing things well. Like I think there is an art to preaching, for example. I'm happy if somebody wants to talk about the rhetorical arts, to how you emphasize your words, how you change the tone of your voice, how you use cadence, how you use repetition. I think there's an art to these things in preaching that is not, frankly, unrelated to the way that an actor acts. Like when I get up and preach, I'm not just talking like I normally talk. I am performing in a sense, and I'm okay with that. That's fine. And I think that you could break down basically everything that happens in a Sunday service in most churches and say that there is an art, a form of expression that is going into these various pieces. What I would want to talk about theologically then is what we call liturgy. And liturgy is why these pieces, why this form, why this articulation, why this order, what are we trying, what is this doing? What is it saying? And this is something, and again, I hadn't asked Barrett about this before. This is something that I just personally think about art. I think art is a communicative act. I think it's an act of communication always. Every form of art, whether the artist wants this to be true or not, I think it's an act of communication. And I think that's true of a worship service, that a worship service is communicative. And I think it's communicative right down to every single moment of it is in some sense communicative. And what liturgy is, or the liturgical arts, if we, instead of talking about worship arts, liturgical arts is sort of like musical arts or theater arts, right? It's like, how do we think about the artistic nature of this form of expression? Mm-hmm. Liturgical art is asking the question, why this progression of events? Why these forms? Why these words? Why these songs? Why these sermons? Why these texts? What are we doing with all these things? And I think that is an utterly important thing for the church. This is something the church, I do think, actually needs to get at and think about a little bit more than we have, especially in evangelicalism. And if people are interested in reading on this front, I would recommend strongly the work of James K.A. Smith from Calvin University, he's a Reformed scholar, but he's done lots of work in this area, and you can look up any number of his books that talk about formation by means of liturgy.
Right.
I like that phrase. I think it's an interesting, the liturgical arts. I think it's a good phrase. I wonder if the phrase worship arts is, I think partly comes in a way to particularly in, like we said, North American evangelical Protestantism, it's like the last thing holding on to liturgy, but we've stripped quite a bit of liturgy away. And so we've had this other term. Historically, I think a lot of what our contemporary practice is rooted in the Jesus People movement in California in the 1960s, and that was a suspicion of structure. It certainly was a time of revival, but you basically had a lot of these rock musicians who became Christians and then just kept doing the same music that they were already doing. And they're like, why don't we just do this with Christian lyrics? And I think that's really, really shaped Protestantism because it was attractive. People were like, oh, this is bringing in the youth and all of these things. And so we've kind of just kept doing that. I don't know if it's evolved enough to incorporate the best of that plus whatever we have lost from. But a lot of those folks were not people who grew up in the Christian faith. They didn't understand liturgy. They were suspicious of things like church buildings. They actually wanted to live communally, and church can be anywhere. They weren't actually paying attention. And I also think that's why when we say worship arts, what we often mean is the music.
Right.
Mostly when you say worship, people think music.
Yeah, because it was a strong connection to music coming out of that movement, which infiltrated the Protestant church extensively in North America, for sure.
Right.
Yeah, and there's a really interesting inflection point that happens with that movement. I think you're absolutely right. It comes out of the Jesus People movement. You think about people like Larry Norman, especially. If you want to read about Larry Norman, Greg Thornberry's got a great book about Larry Norman called "Why Should the Devil Have All the Good Music," which is a line from a Larry Norman song.
There's a great documentary about him too.
Oh yeah, sure, yeah. It's a documentary. Larry Norman's a fascinating dude, but there's an inflection point where Larry's not that welcome actually anymore because what he's doing is art, and he sort of becomes not welcome kind of anywhere. Like the rock musicians don't want him because he's real Christian in bizarre ways, but he's real Christian, and the Christians don't want him because he's real artistic and a little weird. But there's also a place kind of around that time, I think, when you said it's bringing in the young people, that pragmatism, right? That evangelical pragmatism gets a hold. And now we're having conversations like in the quote-unquote seeker-sensitive movement in North American Christianity. How do we get more people into the doors, more butts in the pews? Well, let's have better music. And on the one hand, you can say, okay, like I understand that you're trying to. I actually have a lot of sympathy for the nature of that church music should be folk music in a sense, right? The music of the people, popularized, because it's supposed to be something that we can sing together, like something that everybody that you sing along. It's sing-along music. But that when it gets picked up into the church growth movement, we lose sort of our critical capacity to think through a few things, right? Like, how does this fit within our liturgy? Because for one thing, we start pretending we don't have a liturgy. We just worship Jesus. We don't have a liturgy. Like, well, okay, that's a liturgy though. And then we also, we're happy with the payoff. People are coming, and we're happy enough with the payoff that we're not that critical about how it is that we're forming people by means of this. Like there's he's passed away now, but there's a relatively well-known Eastern Orthodox priest named Thomas Hopko, who I once heard him say, "Yeah, I went to one of those evangelical churches, and it was like a rock concert with a motivational speech at the end." I was like, "Oh, geez, man, you're like cutting me to the quick." But there's something to what he's saying, right? And actually, I would say there's something to what he's saying in the good and the bad there, right? He's challenging a shallowness that needs to be challenged, in my opinion. But I mean, people go to rock concerts for transcendent experiences because they're accessible and engaging, and they're speaking the language of the people. And I do, in fact, think that Christianity should be accessible and engaging and should speak the language of the people. So, I mean, the history of this in North America in the last 100 years is complicated, but interesting. And it hasn't always been baby with the bathwater. It's been complicated. It moves in multiple directions at once.
I do find it interesting that, again, music has been allowed to evolve into exactly that. It's a rock concert. They have sexy lights, big old drum kits, lasers,
smoke machines. Churches have smoke machines pretty regularly now.
We haven't, there has been some pushback, I'm sure, but I can remember playing a short movie clip at my church, and a woman came out and pointed at my chest and said, like, "Not in my church. You're not bringing Hollywood into my church." Right. I was like, "Yeah, but we just did like a rock concert. We just did like with the smoke machines and so music has somehow been given a pass and been allowed to evolve, and yet again, I feel like that's been a much different experience for the theatrical arts or movie, video, dance. Again, like that is still like." What is that?
It's a little taboo still.
It's a little taboo.
But I think that that's changing as well. I would say that, so for example, we're in Calgary right now, if people don't know where we are. Here in Calgary, I know at least 2 or 3 people who are pastors whose job it is to do visual creative work for their congregations. And I've talked to them, I know them, and I consider them to be excellent artists, thoughtful, careful, and good theologians too. Thoughtful. Some of them are my former students, so I have to say they're good theologians. But I think they are authentically. But thoughtful, careful. I wonder if the reason music got that pass, right? It got the. I'm being a little bit free with this, but it got sort of that Calvin pass, like that some of the reformers were down with it. Actually, most of the reformers want to keep music for various reasons, so it gets a bit of a pass. Whereas some of the visual arts, they take it on the nose a little more in the Reformation. And it's taking them a lot longer to get back into the conversation now. But I do think it's happening. I don't think it's happening well everywhere, but I do think it's happening.
There's probably practical reasons for it too, and historical reasons. I mean, historically, music and the church stayed much closer together, like commission. I mean, theater, as soon as it blossomed out of the Middle Ages, it immediately moved outside of the church. It was starting to explore other areas. I don't, maybe because it didn't find a home in the church, but yeah, it historically developed along a much different path than music. So I think that's part of it. I think there's practical reasons too. Doing theater well is really hard and takes a lot of time. You can't just rehearse it on a Thursday night before Sunday and it's amazing usually. And so, and that's true. I saw a show that had spent 14 years to get to Broadway and it closed after 3 weeks. It takes time and to do that. Dance probably has a level of abstraction that people aren't comfortable with. And then, you're reckoning with the human body then too, which the church has always had an interesting relationship as well. With. So, there's probably some practical and historical reasons too why music is considered safer.
And it's also worth saying, I think, that not everything good has to happen in a worship service. There are a lot of good things that I think are sanctifying and sanctified things in the world that are things that devout Christians do that are Christian things to do that don't happen in a Sunday morning service. And I don't have any problem with that. In fact, I think it's a good thing. I'm sort of one of these folks who thinks that all work done well is sanctified and sanctifying. All good work, all honest work done well is sanctifying. And I don't need for like Barrett and both of you do theater work. I don't need you to do it in a church for it to be Christian. I don't even need you to make it about Christianity or overtly about theology to be Christian. I'm one of these obnoxious people who think that the most important Christian filmmaker working in the world today is Martin Scorsese, right? And people are like, wait a second. I'm like, well, that's a long conversation. But there is a way in which, as Christians, we can say, you're a theater producer. Be a theater producer. Do it beautifully. Do it effectively. Do it well. Articulate your vision of the beauty of the world that's informed by your Christian faith and the work that you do. And that's a great thing to do. And it doesn't necessarily have to happen on a Sunday morning, right? But it doesn't mean it can't.
Yeah.
There maybe is a place for it. It's a conversation we can have. But not all art has to happen on a Sunday morning. Like you can't, I've seen people try to do it, but you can't paint a painting.
Right.
Really. I mean, people do it. I mean, I'm sure I'm stepping on somebody's toes in the audience, and I do apologize for that. No. But before we started, I was talking about a student who painted a painting for a class for me. She spent like 4 weeks on it or something.
Yeah.
Because it took that much time. She showed us the pictures of the progression of the layers of the piece. Right. Not everything lends itself to doing.
But I would argue that it could lead us to worship. Like somebody spends somebody spends those 4 weeks, and we contemplate that painting in a liturgy. That would make sense to me, or be part of it. No, what you're saying is interesting. The guy I was referencing earlier, Hans Ruckmacher, he encouraged artists to not do art in the church. Go make art.
Yeah.
As a Christian, the point was, are you doing it from a Christian worldview? Do you understand what it is to be a Christian, and are you creating out of that? Yeah.
Which is, in my opinion, that's a robust theological perspective, right? That's what. Okay, so let's just think about, like, here at Ambrose, we do what we're talking about in a couple of different ways in our curriculum, right? So on the one hand, we have a minor in worship arts, and that's not designed for our ministry students or our theology students. In fact, they can't take it. It's not available to them as an option. It's designed for our arts and sciences students who are training for other things. Particularly, we usually have in mind our art students, but other students as well, who would like to have some theological training, like a small but robust amount of theological training that goes along with their chosen vocation that they're training for, if they're a musician, or if they're a dancer, or if they're in theater, that they can add this theological piece to help them do what you're describing, to think robustly about this, and then go to the world to be an artist in that sense. But we also have the sort of inverse of that, right? We have degrees that help people to train to be ministers, to be pastors in churches. And we offer them options to take minors in dance or theater or music, so that they can take seriously their formation into a craft that is going to inform their work. Like if they think about their vocational calling as being a pastor who leads musical worship on a Sunday morning, or who designs liturgy, right? If they think of themselves as being a liturgist in that sense, then I think it's super for them to have robust time spent in serious training in their craft.
Yeah, not just super, it's necessary.
It's necessary. It's got to happen.
Yeah.
Right? It's because, which is, of course, that's the real tension in this conversation. Is it's hard to do both things well, right? That's always an issue. But we're trying, right? That's something we want to try to be able to do.
Well, I do appreciate that about our approach, because I think it is essential. If art is a communicative act,
which I think it is,
then you're continually wanting to work on your craft. How can you communicate better? How can you be more responsive? And how can that evolve over time as your congregation evolves, et cetera, et cetera? So you have to have a robust craft, as well as the theological underpinning and understanding in order to speak from an authentic Christian worldview.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's interesting because I'm just watching some of the comments on chat sort of coming up as well around the idea that, yes, we don't have to do our craft necessarily in the church service. Plumbers don't necessarily get on stage and install a toilet as a form of worship, although it can be in their own private time. They could work on that. They could change the filters on. I feel that tension too, as an artist and a person of faith. I feel like the church is less than when they do not make space for all the forms of expression, when they don't allow dance like any form of worship. It's not for everyone. That's okay. It's actually for God, whether it's just beautiful spoken word or right. It's so I feel the tension of what you're saying. I have an avenue to do my art outside of my church, and feel like I have great impact in that. But I'll be honest. I miss participating that way at my church, because it's my form of worship. I don't personally engage as much with standing in the congregation and singing love songs to Jesus. That's not my primary communicating tool. It is for lots of people. So how do we train up worship pastors would be one question. How do we train up just pastors to engage with the artists in their communities? How do we do that better?
I mean, part of my answer to this question is some of the things we've said already. This is a theological question. Do we value art? Do we believe that art is intrinsically Christian, right? That it is at some kind of fundamental, non-negotiable level good. The stuff that Paul says that the Philippians should do, whatever is true, whatever is good, whatever is beautiful, think on these things. And my answer to that question is like a wholehearted, yell it from the mountaintops, yes. That art is an intrinsic good, right? That's the first thing I would say. And saying that, it actually goes an awful long way to somebody who has a craft for their spiritual leader to say, your craft is a good thing. Even if they don't do it in the church, your craft is, even to the plumber, your craft is a good thing. It is valuable. So that's one thing I'd say. But the other thing I would say is to develop a serious, robust theology of liturgy, to think really carefully, but what do we mean? There's this hour and a half, whatever it is on Sunday morning, or maybe Sunday evening or Saturday evening these days. It's way more flexible, maybe online for download whenever you can get it. What are you doing, and why are you doing it? What do you mean to be doing? One of the things that one of my mentors, my long ago mentors, named Dr. Gene Rivard, taught me about. He's the person who sort of mentored me into liturgy and leading worship, which is a job I did in my former life. And one of the things he taught me is that there are a lot of people in this congregation, and you need to try to find a way to make moments for them in the course. To do that in an integral way so the service flows and means something, you need to find a way to make moments for them in the service so that they can have that. We started this with the question of the transcendent experience. Is there an avenue for them to have that transcendent experience? That's a question that anybody who does liturgy should be asking themselves honestly on a week-to-week basis.
Right. We have a question. Is there a possible connection historically or currently between how the church embraces art and how the church embraces expressions of emotion compared to logic and reasoning?
I mean, intuitively, that sounds relative. I mean, maybe. It's a funny thing. Oh man, that's a hard question. I have to think about that for quite a while. Sermons tend to be, the sort of popular way of thinking about them is they're sort of like a rationalistic expression, but that's not always true. They can be pretty emotive and subjective sometimes. And I think the rock concert thing, the sort of Jesus is my boyfriend songs, and I don't mean that derogatorily. I mean, Origen thought Jesus was your boyfriend. So in a pretty deep and profound way. I don't know if we always do that well in these songs, but anyway. But those are pretty deeply emotive. Yeah, I'd have to think about that for a while. But I do think I understand what the question is getting at, and there probably is something to it. I don't know, Bear, do you have something more coherent to say about that? I clearly don't. Huh.
Yeah, I think it's cultural.
Yeah.
Right? How do Albertans handle emotion?
Yeah.
Right? Or how do Californians handle emotion or whatever? And I think that does. Yeah, I think there is a relationship because I think emotion is less controllable, and so there's a healthy suspicion. I also think that the way we do art in the church is that you're doing that and having that emotion, and I can privately have mine here, hopefully, and nobody sees it.
Yeah.
Or if I'm really spiritual, I might raise my hand, or something. I might express a little bit if I'm really comfortable with myself. But yeah, so I think there is a relationship with art and emotion because art is emotive. But I agree, so can sermons and things too. But I would look at that from a cultural lens. How do people? How do people deal with emotion, and what level of comfortability do they have with that?
Yeah, like that might be one of the very many places where the North American church should be looking to other cultures, to Christianity embodied in other times and places that maybe have a slightly healthier relationship with emotion than, because I do think you're right. I do think that North America has some peculiar hangups about emotion, both lots of emotion and not enough emotion in some areas. So
emotions,
yeah.
And these are
terrible emotions, and they're sometimes gendered and stuff too. There's all sorts of weird things
That's
we do
true too,
with
yeah.
emotion that and I'm not sure that every culture in all times and places have done those things. So this is a slightly different topic, but broadly speaking, I think the North American church is in desperate need of engagement with the church in other times and places. We're pretty insular about a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, and I think that actually points to some of Val's question about how do we train pastors or how do we train worship leaders, right?
I wish I would have said something about this.
It's sort of being aware of some of these undercurrents and trends historically will help us in our own time too.
Yeah.
Right. There's a question around speaking about an experience, an art experience that you've maybe had inside the church or outside the church that has shaped you, and if there is anything similar about those two pieces, or I often talk about, it's probably 4 minutes. There's a very odd little 4-minute scene in the movie Dead Man Walking.
Yeah, sure, great movie.
Which of course is based on a true story. And it's right before Matthew Poncelet is about to be executed, and his family comes to say goodbye. It's single mom and brothers, and it's probably the last time they're going to see him. And there's not a ton of dialogue. It's just this very awkward sitting in this room, like, what do you say? That scene changed my view on the death penalty. This weird little, I just thought, oh, that's what that is. We're not really just killing him, we're killing the mom and the brothers, we're killing the whole family. And I had heard sermons and read book on pro and con, but that moment in that movie actually changed my worldview on that. So yeah, do either of you have an art experience that maybe like literally changed your mind on something, changed your heart on something, transformed you?
You want me to go?
No, I'm trying to think, so I'm looking.
Oh, okay. I mean, I have so many, but in different ways. I mean, I think, yeah. as a youngster, I had a Sunday school teacher who did fairly sizable theatrical productions. I don't know that they were good or not, but they were certainly formative on me because it gave me a space to creatively express myself in, say grade 3 or whatever. And that has not always been my experience in the church, but it was there, and that was very formative. And I think it's partly why, even though I've tried to do my art outside of the church, I always feel like God calls me back, and maybe not to do it inside the church, but to help other Christians do it, or to help create spaces within the church to do it. So that was deeply formative on me. I think about in the theater. I don't know. One of the things that's great about theater, or one of the things that is theater, is people struggling, and so you're watching various struggles take place. So Theatre Calgary did a production of a play called The Humans. There's all this uber realistic dialogue, some of which is overlapping, you can't hear. The play is a tricky play. A lot of people didn't like it because it shifts genres in the middle of the play. You think it's uber realism, but it turns into a horror genre by the end. And what he was saying is like some of the horror that we create for each other in our realistic everyday lives, and I just watched every character in that hurt other people by the way that they've lived their lives, and that had a big impact on me. I think it makes me more empathetic. I try to understand people better, knowing that we're all doing this to each other, and we need to be mindful. Yeah.
I mean, like you, I could think of any number of, I'm thinking of several different mediums or media and occasions. I've had certainly moments in the church, like the music thing actually kind of does work for me personally, right? Recognizing it doesn't for everybody. But I've had moments in corporate worship where I still myself for a moment and I can feel like the movement of the room or the experience of all these other people with me doing something corporately that is kind of beautiful and profound, and I'm just like moved to tears, like a profound movement that has connected me a number of times to the church in something more than an abstract way. Right, as a theologian, I can explain to you abstractly the way in which I'm a member of the body of Christ, but those were moments when I felt like a member of the body of Christ in the way that like a million grains of sand vibrating at the same frequency feel like the same thing, right? That they're moving in the same way. So I've had those experiences. When I was young, I read quite voraciously. Well, I still do, but particularly into fiction. So there's any number of novels that have like formed me as a human, like that have made me a certain kind of person. Like I talked about this at a faculty thing not too long ago, but the scene with the Bishop of Digne in Les Miserables, like in the novel, which is this really weird. It's super long, and it's like 100 pages or something like that. And when you're reading it, you're like, why is this in this story? It's like it doesn't actually ever quite connect anywhere else. It kind of does. It's a story about though the generosity of a Christian, and that vignette, that scene, that sort of mini, like it's almost like a novella within a novel. It's so long. Victor Hugo like talked me into what the word charity means. It's not like giving somebody money. It's like the fundamental act of what it is to love as a Christian. He talked me into that. I can remember where I was sitting in my room reading like this giant 1,100-page book on my bed, that I'm sure I picked up because I wanted to look smart to somebody. Which was too much of a motivating factor for me at certain points in my life. Like something like that has had a profound effect on me. I can think of here's a funny, and it's going to sound a little bit like a silly one, but it's actually I'm really into this lately. There's a movie, and I like VeggieTales more than other people do. I think. Phil Vischer is quite a brilliant dude.
He is.
Anyway, there's a film not too long ago, a couple of years ago, that came out called Knives Out. Which is a Rian Johnson movie, and I'm a bit of a Rian Johnson fan. And everybody was raving about it, and I watched it, and I'm like, okay, that was good. Like, it's a murder mystery, and it's a good murder mystery. I was like, it was good. What's everybody going on about? And so I watched it again. I was like, oh. Then I watched it again. It's like, oh. And then I watched it again. And then I was like, just like watching scene by scene. And then, like, I think I've seen it 7 times now or something. And every time, and honestly, I could go home tonight and watch it. And it isn't just because it's entertaining, but there's a moment in that movie when Rian Johnson, I don't even know if he meant to do it. I've got like an essay outlined in a notebook at home. I'm going to write about this. Rian Johnson talked me into aesthetics as the window to ethics. That the beautiful is the way into knowing what the good is. And there's, if you go watch that movie and wait for the moment when the main character explains to her friend why she wins when they play Go together, and she's going to say, I'm not trying to beat you. I'm trying to make a beautiful pattern. And like, I think it was like the 4th time I watched it. It was like a knife through me. I was like, oh, Mr. Johnson, you changed like my whole life in just a moment. So anyways, like there's been like a million of those. Yeah, a million of them.
I have a comment saying that perhaps you and Barrett could do a film studies class together.
That would be fun to do too. I do teach a theology and popular culture class. We do a lot of movies in that class, and we're probably going to do Knives Out next year.
100%.
And Barrett has guest lectured in my pop culture class too.
And
We're going to do a final question before we wrap up. Some subscribe to the idea that we need artist missionaries to go out and redeem Hollywood with things like Pure Flicks and God's Not Dead. Does secular art need to be redeemed? How should we engage with secular art and artists as Christians or Christian artists?
Art is not faking. Art is not pretending, and it's certainly not lying. And so if you're going to do Christian art, you can't lie when you do it. It has to be honest in some sense. And so I do think that there is a such thing as art made by Christians. And I said before, and I was not being tongue-in-cheek, that Martin Scorsese is a great Christian filmmaker. But one of the reasons he's a great Christian filmmaker is because he's a Christian, and he's a great filmmaker. And I can understand why somebody feels fuzzy about his Christianity, because I think he feels fuzzy about his own Christianity sometimes. But I think a lot of Christians feel fuzzy about their Christianity
Fair enough.
sometimes, and we don't necessarily throw them under the bus for that. But he attends to his craft with great care. And so what I would say is, if you want to see a really great Christian, I don't like calling it a Christian movie. If you want to see a really great film that engages Christianity in a very serious way, I would say watch Martin Scorsese's Silence.
Oh, yeah.
Which is based on a novel by an author who is a brilliant novelist named Endo, who is a Christian also, and a brilliant novelist. And you will see something that nothing on Pure Flicks can do, right? So, I mean, that's by and large my answer to this question, because the underlying premise for me is that a movie that is bad is failing in some sense to be a good expression of Christianity.
Right. We've also made this false connection that for it to be Christian, it should be safe. Your kids should be able to watch it.
Sure.
So there shouldn't be bad language or sexuality or anything, because that makes it sort of Christian if your 6-year-old can watch it. I don't know if you've read most of the Bible. Also not safe for 6-year-olds, most of it.
Yeah, there's some things that are very complicated.
Right. Yeah. There's some bad language. There's some,
little violence.
Gluttony and adultery and lust and blah, blah, blah. Right? I think, I always remember, I can't remember the name of the movie. It was the prayer one, the prayer warrior.
I'm bad. I don't watch that movie,
Christian, but I was like, I watched War Room, thanks Mo, and that basically every single prayer they prayed, like God answered it in the way they had wanted. So, the marriage is restored, the guy gets out of jail, he's no longer, whatever, I was like, what God are you praying to? Because like,
Yeah.
it's kind of hit and miss for me. Like I did a lot of really important prayers that I'm like, for sure God wants this to be the ending. And it went the other way. But in that movie, that's where we're lying about our God, that he's a slot machine, that we just pray certain things and he will answer them in the way we've asked. Is not an accurate portrayal of my God.
And so I would say, instead of watching War Room, you should go watch Arrival, right? Which is a Denis Villeneuve movie about aliens coming to Earth that asks a lot of the same questions,
Right.
And it's just a better movie. Right? The acting's better, the direction's better, the sound design is better, the story's better, and instead of alienating people who have an experience of suffering, it opens the pathway to ask questions like, what does it mean to know I'm going to suffer and to decide to suffer anyways, right? It's just a different kind of thing. You mentioned the thing about kids, and it is absolutely the case that not everything is for every age group or level of maturity. Not I don't tell my kids every story from the Bible, man. I don't tell them. There are a lot of stories
I
in the
don't want
Bible.
to read all of the stories in the Bible.
They're complicated, right? And eventually I will. It isn't wrong to ask incredibly painful questions.
Right.
The Bible does it constantly. Christian theology does it constantly. It's just there are appropriate times and inappropriate
Absolutely.
times, and you just got to find your spot. I guess
Absolutely.
is what I would say.
Yeah.
I want to answer the first part of that question, which was, does Hollywood need redeemed? And I'd say yes. The entire world needs redeemed, and that is God's business. He's in the redemption business, and we're blessed as part of the church to get to take part in that work. Whether that's going to be through a Christian film, by hiving ourselves off, I don't know. But the first part of that question, the answer is yes. And I think we're fortunate that God lets us be part of that with Him.
Well, and I would say, to your thing about the question of engaging with culture, here maybe somebody like Andy Crouch is a good person to think about, who talks about, his name is falling right out of the back of my head. He's a Japanese American artist who's a Christian, brilliant guy. Yeah, Mago. Fujimoto. Yeah. These guys will talk about culture creation,
Right.
about engaging in the creation of culture, not a hived off Christian subculture,
Right.
but being Christians, participating in the public square, participating in the arguments, the conversations that are happening in our world and in our culture, and doing it as Christians, but doing it well, right? So, and that is the
Although
redemption.
you also don't get to do it well the first time.
No.
So we do have to leave a space for the mess, I think, sometimes.
To be getting better, to be working at your craft, right?
Yeah. So so sometimes I can be a little more forgiving with some of that stuff, even if it's not a great film or a great piece of art.
Right.
Everybody's first try is pretty mediocre.
Not great. Yeah.
And that's actually not a bad thing.
Gentlemen, we could talk all night. I need to go home and watch Knives Out. No, I know, right? I'm on it. I am totally on it. What a pleasure it has been to engage in this. I will leave you with one more Madeleine L'Engle quote, one of my favorites, who says, "Our truest response to the irrationality of the world is to paint or sing or write, for only in such response do we find truth."